In this episode, we're going to take a concept that often gets treated like paperwork and turn it into one of the most practical tools in a privacy program: the data inventory. People new to privacy sometimes imagine an inventory as a giant spreadsheet built once for compliance and then forgotten. But that kind of inventory does not help anyone when a real decision shows up. When a leader asks what data we have, where it lives, who can access it, and why we keep it, the inventory is either the answer or an embarrassing silence. The difference is whether you design the inventory to support operational decisions instead of simply checking a documentation box. A good inventory makes rights requests faster, incidents easier to scope, vendor governance more accurate, and retention rules more enforceable, because it turns vague knowledge into usable facts that teams can trust. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CIPM in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A data inventory is a structured record of what personal data an organization holds and how that data is connected to real systems, processes, and purposes. It is not just a list of data fields, and it is not just a list of systems, because the value comes from linking the two so you can understand how data actually behaves. For privacy management, the inventory also captures context, such as why the data exists, which teams use it, and what sharing and retention expectations apply. Some laws and frameworks, such as the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, push organizations toward a formal record of processing activities, ROPA, but the operational goal is the same even when the structure differs. You need a reliable picture of your data holdings that can be used in daily work, not only during an audit. When the inventory is designed well, it becomes a map you can navigate, not a document you dread updating. The first operational decision an inventory should support is recognizing and locating personal data quickly, because speed and accuracy matter in almost every privacy workflow. If someone submits a rights request, you need to know which systems likely contain their data and what identifiers help you find it. If a security alert suggests unusual access, you need to know whether the affected system holds personal data and what categories are involved. If a product team wants to launch a new feature, you need to know what data it will touch and whether that data is already collected for a compatible purpose. A weak inventory forces teams to rely on memory and informal knowledge, which breaks when employees leave or when systems change. A strong inventory reduces reliance on heroics by providing a consistent reference that can be checked and updated. Operational decision support is the reason the inventory exists, not a nice side effect. Designing the inventory begins with deciding what the unit of documentation is, because you can organize inventories in different ways and each choice shapes usability. Some organizations document by system, listing what personal data each application stores and how it is used. Others document by process, such as onboarding, billing, support, or recruiting, and then link those processes to the systems that support them. A purely system-based inventory can miss the business meaning of the data, while a purely process-based inventory can miss technical realities like hidden copies and integrations. A practical approach often connects both, so you can start from a business question and still land on the actual systems and owners who can take action. The unit should also match how your organization makes decisions, because an inventory that is organized in a way nobody thinks will not be used. The goal is to make the inventory feel like a tool that fits the organization's brain. Once the structure is chosen, the next step is defining the minimum set of fields the inventory must capture to be operationally useful. At a minimum, you need to record what categories of personal data are involved, the purpose for which they are processed, and the system or location where they reside. You also need ownership, meaning who is responsible for the process and who is responsible for the system, because decisions need accountable humans, not vague team names. You need access context, such as which roles can view or export the data, because internal sharing controls depend on knowing how data is exposed. You need sharing context, such as whether data is sent to vendors or partners and under what role, because external sharing governance depends on that linkage. You need retention expectations, because a record that cannot inform deletion planning will not support risk reduction. This information set is what allows the inventory to answer real questions without forcing a new investigation every time. Beginners often assume the hardest part is listing data elements, but the more important part is making the inventory meaningful without drowning it in detail. You do not need to document every single database column on day one to be operationally valuable, especially if the organization has many systems. Instead, you need enough granularity to support decisions, such as identifying whether a system contains contact information, financial details, authentication data, behavioral data, or potentially sensitive categories depending on your context. Over time, you can deepen detail for high-risk systems and high-impact processes, which is a risk-based approach that keeps the program practical. The inventory should also capture data sources, meaning whether the information comes directly from individuals, from devices, from partners, or from internal creation, because source affects transparency expectations and quality concerns. When the inventory is built with sensible levels of detail, it becomes usable, and usability is what ensures it stays alive. Building the initial inventory requires careful intake methods, because the facts you need are spread across teams and sometimes across documentation that is incomplete or inconsistent. System owners know what platforms exist and how they are configured, but they may not understand the business purpose for the data. Business owners know why data is used, but they may not understand where copies are stored or which integrations send data to other places. Privacy teams often bridge these perspectives by conducting structured interviews and walkthroughs that tie processes to systems and then validating those claims using artifacts like data flow diagrams, vendor contracts, and access control records. Validation matters because people often describe what they believe the system does rather than what it actually does today. A well-run inventory build treats early records as hypotheses that must be confirmed, not as final truth. That approach reduces the risk of building an inventory that looks polished but fails when tested by a real request or incident. For an inventory to support operational decisions, it also needs clear linkage between data and identifiers, because most privacy work involves finding data about a specific person. If one system stores people by email address, another uses an internal account ID, and a vendor uses a token, the inventory should help you understand those linkages so searches are not guesswork. This is especially important when a person has multiple relationships, such as being both a customer and a job applicant, because their data may exist under different identifiers in different contexts. The inventory does not need to store full identity data, but it should record which identifiers are used and how matching is typically performed, so rights operations can plan verification and search steps. This linkage also helps incident response, because it can reveal whether a leaked identifier could be tied back to individuals and how quickly that could happen. When identifier linkage is captured, the inventory becomes a navigation system, not just a catalog. Inventories also need to address the reality of data copies and derived datasets, because personal data rarely stays confined to the system where it was first collected. Reporting systems, analytics warehouses, backups, and logs can all contain personal data, and these locations can be overlooked because they do not feel like the primary system of record. If your inventory ignores these copies, it will mislead decision-making, especially for deletion, retention, and breach scoping. A practical inventory records not only where primary records live, but also where data is exported, replicated, or transformed, including whether those downstream datasets still contain direct identifiers or use pseudonymous keys. That information helps you decide how to fulfill deletion requests, how to enforce retention rules, and how to evaluate the impact of an incident. This is where inventories become deeply operational, because they reveal the true footprint of personal data beyond the places people think to look. Another operational decision inventories must support is vendor governance, because third-party relationships are often the fastest route for data to leave your environment. If a process shares personal data with a processor, the inventory should capture that recipient, the category of data shared, and the purpose of the sharing, along with a reference to the governing agreement. This linkage helps privacy teams respond quickly when a vendor changes, when a subprocessor list updates, or when a vendor experiences an incident. It also helps rights operations because you can identify which vendors may need deletion or access instructions for a given individual. Without this connection, Vendor management becomes reactive, and teams often discover vendor involvement only when something goes wrong. Inventories help prevent that surprise by making external sharing visible as part of the data holding picture. When vendor relationships are embedded in inventories, decision-making becomes faster and more defensible. Retention and disposal are another area where inventories prove their value, because you cannot delete what you cannot locate, and you cannot justify retention without understanding purpose and location. A retention schedule might say delete inactive accounts after a defined period, but execution requires knowing which systems store account data, which downstream systems copy it, and what exceptions apply. If the inventory records retention expectations by dataset and location, teams can implement deletion processes with fewer gaps and fewer accidental over-retention patterns. The inventory also supports defensible explanations when deletion is not possible in certain places, such as backups, because you can document constraints and compensating controls like limited retention and restricted access. A beginner mistake is assuming retention policy drives deletion automatically, but inventory is the bridge that translates policy into operational action. When the inventory is aligned with retention rules, disposal becomes routine rather than chaotic. To keep inventories operational, you must design them as living assets with ownership and update triggers, because stale inventories are worse than no inventories. Stale inventories create false confidence, leading teams to make decisions based on outdated assumptions about what data is collected or where it flows. Update triggers should connect to the same workflows that create change, such as new system onboarding, vendor procurement, major feature releases, and process changes in areas like HR or customer support. Ownership should be clear, meaning each inventory entry has a responsible owner who confirms accuracy periodically and updates it when changes occur. The privacy function can coordinate and provide standards, but system and process owners must participate because they are closest to reality. This shared ownership model prevents the inventory from becoming a privacy-only project that loses relevance over time. Living maintenance is what makes inventories trustworthy. Quality control is the discipline that keeps an inventory from becoming an unverified collection of statements, and it matters because operational decisions rely on accuracy. Quality control can include periodic sampling, where privacy teams select a subset of inventory entries and validate them against system configurations, access lists, integration mappings, or recent change tickets. It can include checks for completeness, such as ensuring every high-risk process has a documented owner, retention expectation, and sharing record. It can include consistency checks, such as verifying that terms like purpose and data categories are used in a standardized way so reports and dashboards can be built. Quality control also includes resolving conflicts, like when a business team claims a dataset is not shared externally but integration evidence suggests it is. These checks should be framed as program health work, not blame, because the goal is to keep the inventory aligned with reality as systems evolve. An inventory that is measured and validated becomes a reliable foundation. A final design principle is making inventories usable, because even accurate inventories fail if they are hard to navigate or hard to apply to real questions. Usability means people can search by process, system, data category, vendor, or owner, and find what they need without interpreting cryptic codes. It means inventory entries are written in plain language with enough precision to guide action, such as specifying whether a vendor receives identifiers or only aggregated data. It also means inventories integrate with other program tools like rights request playbooks, incident response checklists, and vendor assessment workflows, so the inventory is used naturally as part of doing work. When inventories live in isolation, people forget they exist, and privacy work returns to ad hoc investigations. When inventories are designed as working references, they become part of the organization's muscle memory. Usability is not cosmetic. It is the difference between documentation and operational capability. As you wrap up, remember that documenting data holdings is not about building a perfect catalog. It is about building a decision tool that helps the organization act responsibly with speed and confidence. An inventory supports real operational decisions when it links data categories to purposes, systems, owners, access patterns, sharing relationships, and retention expectations in a way people can actually use. It becomes a bridge between privacy commitments and day-to-day workflows, making rights fulfillment more reliable, incident response more accurate, and vendor governance more defensible. The strongest inventories are built with validation, maintained through clear triggers and ownership, and protected by quality checks that keep them aligned with changing reality. When this work is done well, privacy stops relying on institutional memory and starts relying on a shared map that teams trust. That trust is what turns the inventory from a compliance artifact into a core operating tool for a mature privacy program.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.